It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Kenneth Aigen. Dr. Aigen is an associate professor in music therapy at New York University. He's lectured internationally and authored numerous publications in Notif-Robbins, on Notif-Robbins music therapy, qualitative research, and music-centered music therapy. Two of his books, Pathways of Development in Notif-Robbins music therapy and music-centered music therapy, have been translated into Japanese and Korean. Dr. Aigen is president of the Notif-Robbins Music Therapy Foundation. He's also past president of the American Association for Music Therapy and was the scientific committee chairman for the 9th World Congress for Music Therapy held in Washington, D.C. in 1999. His honors include the Research and Publications Award from the American Music Therapy Association and the Limbach Award for Distinguished Teaching from Temple University. His most recent publication is the book titled The Study of Music Therapy, Core Issues and Concepts, published by Routledge. So I welcome Dr. Kenneth Aigen.
Water before we start. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming today. I really consider it a privilege to be able to share my thinking in a forum like this one, and I'm grateful for the gift of your time and attention. This is the first time I'm on this campus since we lost Evelyn Selesky, longtime director of Malloy's music therapy program. And I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Evelyn. When I was 24 years old in the fall of 1980, I applied for a job as a pianist for a theater arts group at the Lifeline Center, a school for children with emotional disabilities. The person whose position I was applying for was Evelyn. I didn't get the gig, but I did accept an offer of employment as a teacher's assistant at the school. I happened to run into Evelyn when I was at the school completing some paperwork. She was extremely friendly and warm to me and told me that she was leaving the job to pursue a degree in something called music therapy at New York University. She said that if I liked working with the kids at the school, that I ought to consider music therapy. And the quality of the encounter with Evelyn played a direct role in getting me to NYU and creating a career and a life in music therapy. I'd also like to thank the Rebecca Center and the music therapy program staff, particularly Suzanne Sorrell and John Carpente. John's one of those friends who invites you to do things that you may really want to do, but always wind up being a lot more work than you think they'll be. So John, I hope I can repay that favor before too long. And last, I'd like to give a shout out to CJ Shiloh, who's in the audience today. CJ and her colleague Sunny are partners in a groundbreaking venture presenting sensory-friendly concerts to autistic people and their friends and family members. You'll be hearing more about the program later, but I want to acknowledge how inspiring she's been for me and how much she's helped me to learn about the contemporary autistic community. In preparing for this talk, it became clear to me that autistic people and their families have been severely mistreated by the healthcare professionals charged with helping them. The litany of mistreatment is staggering, including electroconvulsive therapy, inappropriate psychotropic medications, blaming parents for their children's difficulties, warehousing autistic people for decades in completely inappropriate institutions that only made their difficulties worse, the offering of quack dietary and vitamin-based cures, and the dissemination of fraudulent research claiming a role for childhood vaccines in causing autism. So my talk today is informed by a belief that the entire professional, clinical, educational, and research community has a moral and ethical obligation to remedy the mistakes of the past. I first became aware of autism during my studies as a psychology undergraduate in the mid-1970s. Over time, I became familiar with names such as Kanner, Rimland, Wing, and Bettelheim. But I didn't have a clear sense of the role of each individual in relation to autism. However, reading a recent book titled Neurotribes, The Legacy of Autism and The Future of Neurodiversity by Steve Silberman has been a life-changing event for me. It offers the most complete and insightful account of the history of autism that I've come across, and its narrative serves as the source for the brief history of autism that I'd like to begin with today. Silberman's thesis is that the history of autism, as it's commonly told and understood, is fundamentally flawed in ways that render autistic people in previous generations harder to see. Consequently, that autism appears as a 20th century phenomenon and that its prevalence is seen as dramatically increasing in recent years are really both based on a fallacy. The contemporary history begins with Hans Asperger, a medical doctor who was working at a clinic in the 1930s Vienna when he first encountered autistic children. It was in 1938, after the German annexation of Austria, that Asperger gave his first talk on autism. And even then he displayed progressive tendencies, arguing that not everything that steps out of line and is thus abnormal must necessarily be inferior. He urged the clinicians in attendance at this first talk not to give up on such children, because through maturation, their functioning could improve in ways not considered possible when they were young. Asperger made a choice in this talk that contributed to confusion about the patients he saw and about the connection between Asperger's syndrome and autism. He focused on the more verbal clients as a way of giving a more promising description of his therapeutic approach. But this choice led to the misunderstanding that that Asperger only worked with so-called high-functioning children. Silberman asserts that this era has obscured the most important aspects of Asperger's discoveries about autism, that it wasn't at all rare, that it was found in all age groups, and that it had a broad range of manifestations, from the inability to speak to an enhanced capacity for focusing on a single object of interest for an extended period of time. Asperger understood from the beginning that autism existed as a spectrum. Although he survived the war, Asperger's work and contributions were nearly lost in the rubble of his clinic and in the chaos of post-war Europe. And while Asperger's thesis was published in German, nearly contemporaneously with Leo Kanner's first publication on the topic, it was Kanner's work that was publicized and that became known. The condition he wrote about was known throughout the world as Kanner syndrome. That Kanner and Asperger made a nearly simultaneous discovery is considered a coincidence in most historical accounts. But Silberman argues that Kanner likely knew about Asperger's work and that he deliberately withheld credit from Asperger due to differences in how they thought about the syndrome. First, as a medical doctor in Berlin during the 1920s, Kanner was a native speaker of German, and his citations in all his papers show that he was familiar with all of the papers on child psychiatry from that era that were written in German. More importantly, Hans Asperger's primary diagnostician, George Frankl, was brought to America by Kanner through a program to help Jewish medical professionals escape Nazi-conquered lands. Frankl was hired by Kanner to become the psychiatrist pediatrician at the Child Study Home of Maryland, a facility that Kanner had established. Moreover, Frankl's wife was Annie Weiss, the other half of Asperger's team. Kanner never mentioned Asperger's contributions in his written works. His defenders say that he was simply unaware of it, although the fact that he had such a close working relationship with two essential members of Asperger's team challenges such a claim. Kanner's first ideas were first presented in a 1943 paper entitled Autistic Disturbances of Affective Contact. He claimed that the condition he had been observing for 5 years was unique and previously unreported, although there were many publications describing what was then called childhood schizophrenia. Silberman describes how Kanner's view of autism had already diverged radically from the model that Asperger and his colleagues had developed in Vienna. Kanner only focused on childhood, so there could be no autistic adults or adolescents. And rather than offering a concept of autism that incorporated a wide range of functioning with greatly differing manifestations as Asperger had done, Kanner described his patients as a strictly defined, homogeneous group. It appears as if he suppressed individual differences to substantiate his claim of discovering a new syndrome. The effort to portray autistic people as essentially alike has been a stereotype that autistic self-advocates have taken pains to dispel. Sparrow Rose Jones, an autistic author, tells us, "Do not assume that I represent all autistics, because we are as different from one another as non-autistic people are from each other." Even though he's known as the so-called discoverer of autism, Kanner was wrong in most of his assertions about it. For many decades, Kanner argued that autism was monolithic, only present in children, and exceedingly rare. He believed that it was a tragic form of childhood psychosis, akin to schizophrenia, caused by inadequate parenting. 3 years before Kanner wrote his 1943 paper, the Frankls left Baltimore. So with this collaboration no longer intact, Kanner lost contact with Asperger's prescient views about autism. There were two negative consequences when Asperger's view was temporarily lost to history. First, the fact that autism could have a genetic component was eliminated. And two, families were now seen as the cause of autism through the infamous concept of the refrigerator mother. Autism became a source of shame and stigma for families, while the theories of its genesis and family dynamics sent autism research and treatment off in the wrong direction for decades. Kanner considered the obsessions of his child patients merely as a desperate bid for parental affection, rather than legitimate focuses of minds that operated quite differently from typical ones. Kanner's refusal to recognize the genetic component of autism and its spectrum nature, and his claim that it was exceedingly rare, had extraordinarily pernicious effects on autistic people. As late as 1957, Kanner said he'd only seen 150 true cases of autism in his entire career, and that he turned away 9 out of 10 children referred to his office as autistic by other clinicians without confirming an autism diagnosis. Being prevented from having an accurate diagnosis meant that autistic people were denied access to the counseling, educational, financial, and therapeutic support services that would have greatly enhanced their lives. It also left them with no explanation for the constant struggles in employment, dating, friendships, and just simply navigating the chaos of daily life. Bruno Bettelheim was the other central figure in autism at this time. In 1956, he received a $340,000 grant from the Ford Foundation for a 5-year study of autism, amount that's roughly equivalent to $3 million in contemporary dollars. He advocated that bad parenting caused autism and that years of milieu therapy could produce a complete cure. Similar to Kanner, Bettelheim's approach to treating autism was based on a complex web of misconceptions and fabrications that caused parents untold grief. And yet both of them actually offered highly humane treatment to the children in their care, and they thus provided a good alternative to the brutality of most state institutions. Bernard Grimlin was the father of an autistic boy whose 1964 book, Infantile Autism, was instrumental in discrediting the idea that autism was caused by toxic parenting. It's a curious outcome given that Leo Kanner wrote the foreword to his book. Even though he was an outsider to child psychiatry because of his professional training, Grimlin's work firmly established autism as an inborn condition based in genetics and neurology. Grimlin's status as a parent motivated him to establish the National Society for Autistic Children, NSAC, which accomplished many important tasks. It helped to end decades of shame and isolation for families, and it lobbied for legislation based on the principle that all children have the right to an education, including those with developmental disabilities. Rimland formed an alliance with the psychologist Oliver Lovas to establish a means to train autistic people to become indistinguishable from their peers. He also pushed for a number of ultimately discredited orthomolecular cures, such as special diets, megavitamin supplements, and alternative medicines. Although his role in creating the family advocacy movement was very positive, he wound up diverting the resources generated by this movement into an endless quest for a cure, thus preventing the resources from being used in more beneficial ways. Nevertheless, Rimland's NSAC helped reframe autism in the minds of professionals from a form of childhood emotional disturbance to an inborn disability that required lifelong care and support. The psychologist Charles Foerster was a strong influence on Lovas's thinking. He believed that autism was a form of early schizophrenia and described research that involved locking an autistic child in a small room every day for a year. The child's tantrums eventually disappeared, which convinced Foerster they were contingent on reinforcement. He proposed that parents made their children more autistic by rewarding tantrums with attention. So he advised them to ignore the child's distress until the tantrums disappeared on their own. In 1961, Lovas opened a clinic for autistic children at UCLA. And in his first year, only one child was referred, so he spent all of his time with her. The girl's name was Beth. Silberman describes Lovas's first investigations with Beth as being like a music appreciation class from hell. And here I'm quoting Silberman. For months, the psychologist and his assistants played children's songs for her on a guitar while reinforcing proper social behavior by smiling and saying, "That's a good girl," whenever she clapped or sang along. Beth was a good girl. Within 2 months, she was clapping her hands in rhythm and joining in rousing choruses of "The Children in the Bus Go Wiggle, Wiggle, Wiggle." The more she was engaged by the music, the less she banged her head on the furniture and flapped her hands. Then the first extinction trial began. This time the experimenters withheld their smiles and praise. At first she responded to the sudden chill in the air by clapping and singing along even more vigorously. But after more than a week of getting no response, she started beating herself up more than ever. During the acquisition trials, her behavior would improve dramatically. But during the extinction trials, she hurt herself so badly that Lovas aborted the experiment. Lovas claimed that his relationship with Beth allowed him to see the inner being lurking behind her autistic shell. What he claimed to understand of Beth's motivations and manipulations enraged him. In an interview with Psychology Today, Lovas said that Beth would only hit steel cabinets, and she'd only hit them on the edge because, you see, she wanted to draw blood. So he reacted automatically, as he would have with one of his own children. And I'm quoting here, "I reached over and cracked her one right on the rear. She stopped hitting herself for about 30 seconds. Then she hit herself once more. At first I thought, God, what have I done? But then I noticed she'd stopped hitting herself. I felt guilty, but I felt great. Then she hit herself again, and I really laid it on her. I let her know that there was no question in my mind that I was going to kill her if she hit herself once more. She hit herself a few times more, but we had the problem licked." Lovas knew that his so-called treatment was unethical, so he had to describe his work within accepted university guidelines. For this, he turned to the language of behaviorism, which allowed him to frame his abusive punishments as innocent-sounding aversive stimuli. The types of behaviors that Lovas targeted for punishment expanded to include hand flapping, rocking, spinning, and other forms of self-stimulation. It's important to note that research has shown that Lovas was completely wrong and that his efforts were actually counterproductive. Research has demonstrated the value of stimming for autistic people. Autistic people stim to reduce anxiety, and also simply because it feels good. Harmless forms of self-stimulation, like flapping and fidgeting, may facilitate learning by freeing up executive functioning resources in the brain that would be otherwise devoted to suppressing them. For Lovaas, however, self-injury, self-stimulation, and echolalia were all of a piece and equally ripe for extinction. After working with Beth, Lovaas worked with 5-year-old twins, Mike and Marty. His use of aversives led him to using a sadistic research design where the punishment was extremely loud sound. This was used to produce pain or fear in the twins as a way of making the adult's presence more meaningful and more rewarding by comparison. When these studies were not effective, he turned to the stronger punishment of electric shock. Metal strips were laid on a floor in a way that they could not be avoided. The shock intensity was set to a level meant to be painful and frightening. The boys were together in a room with the researchers. The researchers would call them over with outstretched arms, and if they didn't come to the researchers within 3 seconds, they would receive an electric shock. If the boys tried to escape a shock in any way other than approaching the experimenter, such as by sitting down or trying to climb onto the window ledge, they would receive a shock. They were being conditioned to approach and embrace the very people that were propagating their abuse. In later designs, the experimenter would say, "Hug me," or "Kiss me," and the boys would get a shock if they did not comply within 3 seconds. Lovaas made no effort to hide his comfort and even his pleasure with inflicting pain, particularly in the use of food and water deprivation as a form of punishment. As Silverman describes, Lovaas put Mike and Marty on a strict behavioristic diet, no food at all, 7 days a week, except the token scraps they could earn by acquiring the ability to perform complex social tasks while pressing a bar to avoid a shock. Water deprivation was also stringently enforced, although he noted that to avoid dehydration, water was available to the boys after 6 p.m. each day. "Let me tell you, it's a pleasure to work with a child who is on mild food deprivation," Lovaas told a room full of parents, "particularly if he has a history of being a good eater, because that's a child who's truly motivated to learn." Highly overstated claims for the effectiveness of treatment characterizes both Lovaas's and Rimland's treatments. In 1987, Lovaas claimed that nearly half the children in his experimental group achieved normal intellectual and educational functioning by being in ABA treatment starting at 3 years old. He convinced the world that autism did not have to be a chronic problem. Although independent researchers have never been able to replicate Lovaas's findings, Rimland still defended him, saying it was natural that as a pioneer he was treated with hostility. Rimland also claimed dramatic results from megavitamin therapy, and his research was equally flawed and not generally accepted. Another pioneer in autism research was Lorna Wing, also the parent of an autistic child. We live in a time that is directly influenced by her work, and many contemporary developments were enabled by her contributions, which were both extensions of and consistent with Asperger's original formulations. She used the diagnostic label of Asperger's syndrome, and she asserted that all the features that characterize Asperger's syndrome can be found in varying degrees in the normal population. She thus laid the foundation for seeing autism as being on a continuum with typical functioning. Her terminology changed from continuum to the term spectrum, because this term evoked pleasing images of rainbows and other phenomena that attest to the infinitely various creativity of nature. Wing's championing of the spectrum view had a number of important consequences, not the least of which was enabling tens of thousands of children, teenagers, and adults to finally gain access to the educational placements and the social services that they deserved. As autistic adults such as Temple Grandin became publicly known, Many of the previously held assumptions about autism were challenged. Once highly articulate, intelligent, and engaged in the world people were seen as autistic, the concept of self-advocacy and empowerment could emerge. Wing's work validated many of Asperger's original ideas about autism. Asperger's own publications express support for the view that autism is a personality type that could become profoundly disabling in the absence of adequate adaptation by the patient and by the environment. In this way, Asperger anticipated the modern neurodiversity movement. In 1980, the category of infantile autism was first included in DSM-3. The initial entry reflected Kanner's views, many of which were mistaken. With the term early infantile in the title, there was no room for autistic adults or for people with different onset times or with different sets of markers or characteristics. Silberman asserts that DSM-3 was really not based on sound science and that much of the data behind it was sketchy and provisional, nowhere more so than in the discussion of pervasive developmental disorders. It was not until the publication of DSM-3R in 1987 that real progress was made in the area of autism, primarily due in part to Lorna Wing's participation in the Autism Working Group. In the revision, the word autism, the word infantile was deleted, and the new category was called autistic disorder, which was present across the entire lifespan. The category of pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified was expected to be a minor footnote, but it became an even more diagnosed condition, largely due to the fact that, like Asperger's syndrome, it was an autism diagnosis that didn't contain the word autism, and thus was more readily accepted by parents and healthcare workers. Didn't have the stigma that the term autism did. So the prevalence of autism increased dramatically after the publication of DSM-3 and 3R, because awareness of it was growing among professionals, and because the criteria used to diagnose the condition had expanded. The confluence of these factors alone could explain the dramatic increase in the prevalence of autism diagnoses. But after the publication of DSM-4, these numbers underwent an even more dramatic increase. Incredibly, there was a small typographical error in the diagnostic criteria for PDD not otherwise specified that greatly contributed to the spiking of these numbers. Here again is Silberman's explanation of what happened. Instead of requiring that a child display impairments in social interaction, communication, and behavior before getting a diagnosis of PDD, NOS, the criteria substituted the word or for and. This fateful typo went uncorrected for 6 years, and it was unacknowledged in the literature until the editor of DSM-4, Michael First, finally copped to it in a notably understated article in an obscure journal in 2002. Until author Roy Richard Grinker called attention to the typo in his 2008 book, Unstrange Minds, hardly anyone outside the usual tiny circle of experts was aware of it. For her part, Wing was unsurprised by the rising number of autism diagnoses. She worked to expand its narrow definition and did this precisely to help more people get the diagnosis so that they could then receive the support services that they needed, rather than have to struggle along without help as they had in the 1960s. So when the spectrum was broadened to include verbal adults, autistic people could now speak for themselves. In the early 1990s, autistic adults first began attending meetings of professional associations and autism organizations headed by parents. Encountering resistance there and finding that their needs were not met, they formed the first organization that was run by autistic individuals for autistic advocacy. This was the Autism Network International, ANI. There have been many other organizations formed since then, with the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, ASAN, being one of the most prominent and successful ones. Autistic people have traditionally not been included in policy, research, and service decisions that affect them. Decisions in these areas generally conflict with their wishes and desires. Self-advocates such as Ari Neiman believe that the traditional autism community has been driven by a set of priorities different from our own, because it is led almost exclusively by those not on the autism spectrum. There's a growing rift between advocacy groups and self-advocacy groups. Many people work on behalf of autistic people in what is described as the autism movement. This movement generally works for changes in public policy and is predominantly led by parents of autistic children. However, the autistic movement is generally led by autistic people themselves and is primarily focused on changing the view of autism in society to one of difference rather than disability. The tension between these two groups is due to differing agendas. The autism movement shares with the medical community the notion of autism as a destructive condition to be eliminated. In contrast, the autistic movement is advancing a different view, which, while not minimizing the difficulties that autism can cause, also considers the strengths and potentials that being autistic provides. The movement promotes autism as difference rather than damage or disability through employing the concept of neurodiversity. The characteristics of autism are considered to be a manifestation of neurodiversity in comparison to the neurotypical cognitive profile that is more common. The idea is that many of these differences only become areas of disability because of lack of understanding and accommodation in the larger culture. Framing their identity as a form of neurodiversity permits self-advocates to draw on conceptualization of the strengths and possibilities inherent in being autistic. Autistic self-advocacy emerged as a civil rights movement based on the simple idea that the most astute interpreters of autistic behavior are autistic people themselves, rather than their parents or doctors. It's not just a claim for more appropriate and enhanced levels of service, accommodation, and awareness. In fact, autism awareness is looked at as an overly limited goal, inferior to the need for autism acceptance. Autistic people argue that the way that they have been treated violates their rights to self-determination, freedom, and civil liberty. They no longer accept being treated as people unable to make competent decisions on their own. Autistic people are viewed under the neurodiversity model as individuals who possess a blend of cognitive strengths and weaknesses in the following core domains: language, communication, sensory processing, motor skill execution, and goal-oriented and reflexive thinking. The precise combination of strengths and difficulties in these areas are unique to each autistic person, although there are some patterns, as Robertson describes. Many autistic people have key strengths that include detailed thinking, expansive long-term memories, a comfort with rules and guidelines, and an affinity for analyzing complex patterns in the social and physical worlds. Likewise, many autistic people have key difficulties in managing several simultaneous tasks, understanding social nuances, filtering competing sensory stimuli, and planning tasks of daily living. The neurodiversity perspective argues that by not taking the needs of autistic people into account, society exacerbates their challenges. It's similar to how difficult it was for left-handed people to negotiate a physical world where all tools were designed for right-handed individuals. This is why changing society in attitudes, expectations, and practices can greatly enhance the quality of life for autistic people. Bagatelle articulates how this perspective considers characteristically autistic behaviors. Repetitive movements and lack of eye contact, which are considered problematic in the biomedical paradigm, need to be understood as difference and not considered a behavior that needs to be changed. People with autism are considered worthy individuals in and of themselves, not people who need to be cured, altered, or isolated from the world. Autism is seen as a fundamental part of who they are, not just something that they have. That is, if their autism were eliminated, they would not be the same person. No human being can survive without social support and adaptations. Autistic people aren't unique in this regard. The problem for autistic people is that our culture is not constructed with them in mind. Predominant social expectations and physical environments intensify their areas of sensitivity and challenge. But all people need social and physical environments that are congruent with their social, sensory, and cognitive styles. In an autistic environment, many of us would feel disabled. And a suitably constructed social and physical environment can alleviate or lessen the limiting aspects of autism. Autistic people experience autism as a core aspect of their identity, not something alien to it that must be removed. To understand this perspective, consider your own sensory, cognitive, social, and communicative preferences and styles. It would be impossible for any of us to imagine what it would be like, or even if we would be the same person without them. Asking autistic people to consider themselves apart from autism is to make the same impossible request. Sparrow Rose Jones describes this dilemma from her perspective as an autistic person. There are things about autism I would like to mitigate, but the thought of removing my autism altogether frightens me, because I don't know who I would be if I had a different brain. You don't have autism, you are autism. It is your thoughts and perception, desires, and being. You cannot draw a circle around a part of yourself and say, here is autism, and everywhere else there is not autism. It is who you are, and it is beautiful and painful and joyous and tragic and challenging and fascinating and real. The notion of a cure is anathema to autistic people because it translates into the stripping away of their sense of self. Because autistic self-advocates consider autism as part of their identity, they argue against first-person language guidelines, premised on the idea that autism is negative and something to be eliminated. When the attributes of autism are seen as inextricable from the person's identity, person-first language becomes an oppressive force. Autistic people don't want normalization in the sense of losing their autistic features, but they want it in the sense of having obstacles removed and help granted towards achieving what they want out of life. Ari Neiman, a self-advocate who I quoted earlier, is the president and the co-founder of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. In 2009, President Obama nominated him to the National Council on Disability. He says that the desire for normalcy for autistic people doesn't mean having their identity changed. It means being given assistance to reach the things we cannot access in our lives due to lack of support, inaccessible environments, and educational and medical systems that are not responsive to our needs. It's without a doubt true that many autistic people across the lifespan face much more difficulty in many spheres of life. Yet at the same time, the autism spectrum is inclusive of more than a series of impairments. Many of the traits we possess can be, in the proper context, strengths or at least neutral. So the tension between the medical and the social models of autism is most clearly seen in the dispute about how resources should be directed, either towards funding a biomedical cure or providing services that enhance the lives of people in the present. One of the disagreements that self-advocates have with advocacy organizations such as Autism Speaks is that very little of the money raised addresses the day-to-day needs of autistic people and their families. The concept of cure embraced by Autism Speaks and similar organizations is problematic in two ways. It's based on the assumption of autism as a disease that requires elimination, and it ignores the very real financial needs of people with autism and their families for funds that could make their present lives more bearable. Silverman notes that while the outside world maintained a running controversy on the role of vaccines in causing autism, autistic adults were engaged in a very different conversation about the difficulties of navigating and surviving in a world not built for them. By creating their community and through sharing the stories of their lives, they discovered that many of the challenges they face are not symptoms of autism, but hardships imposed by a society that refuses to make basic accommodations for people with cognitive disabilities as it does for people with physical disabilities. This recognition is what supports the focus on social action for people with autism. It pushes people into efforts to affect societal change instead of just focusing on medical treatments. In other words, what needs curing is society, not the person with autism. So the deficit model of autism really misses strengths of autistic people and misconstrues strengths as deficits. Self-advocates who argue for this neurodiversity perspective do so from an ethical and a legal foundation based upon the obligations that society has to provide equal treatment to all. Yet they also argue that the neurodiversity perspective reflects better science in that it incorporates a more complex and therefore a more accurate view of autism. One of the parents of an autistic boy interviewed by Silverman talked about how, after visiting an aquarium, her son Leo added the chirps of a beluga whale to his repertoire of echolalia. Silverman describes echolalia as the way that autistic people sample the speech they hear around them. This description shows how the choice of language has within it explicit and implicit meanings that can either distort or enlighten us. Calling sound-making echolalic implies a mechanical reproduction that is inhuman and without purpose, intentionality, or consciousness. Seeing it instead as a form of sampling does two things. It connects the actions of an autistic person to a common phenomenon of non-autistics, putting us all on the same spectrum, and it supports the notion that autistic behavior is purposeful, communicative, and the result of an intelligent mind. Another problem with the deficit view of autism is the inability to understand that autistic behaviors are functional efforts at self-regulation and communication. Attempting to eliminate them denies autistic people their natural means of communication and self-regulation. A progressive research approach based upon the needs of autistic people as they see them would focus on the communicative potentials of their actions. Sparrow Rose Jones also pleads for acceptance in this area because the intense focus that autistic people engage in can produce an inner calm, regardless of whether or not the subject of this focus seems to have some utilitarian purpose. Her words again. Our ability to really focus in deeply on things should be encouraged, even when the interest is something unusual that seems like it's not going to have any real-world application. It's better for us to be allowed to spend some time really honed in on it because these are the times when our brain is really developing in good ways and we're feeling happy and calm. Calm contentment can sometimes be difficult to find for autistics, so I wish you would let us have it where we find it, not always pushing us to try to find it where you think we're supposed to find it. When autism is considered an entity to be eliminated, autistic tendencies become an enemy. However, this perspective is disempowering and works against self-acceptance. Sparrow Rose Jones again talks about how she can use these tendencies in the service of her own health. Autism can be an advantage. When I can steer my routines well, I can make habits out of healthy things really easily. People compliment me on how much self-discipline I have when it comes to sticking to healthy habits. But it's not so much self-discipline as it is me learning how to use aspects of my autism to my advantage. It's a matter of learning how to float downstream and let my neurology carry me where I want to go, instead of always fighting to swim upstream against the grain of my brain. So it's not necessarily the needs of autistic people that make them different or causes them difficulties. It's the reaction of their minds when these needs are not fulfilled that is problematic. Sparrow details her struggles in understanding what really differentiates the autistic mind from the neurotypical mind. She observes that many people in an ongoing class or a weekly religious service gravitate to the same seat each week. So this desire for sameness seems universal to her. However, the problem is that when she can't get her seat, she often has to leave because the unfamiliarity of sitting in a new location is overwhelming to her. There also is a natural variation in the functioning profile of people with autism, both on a day-to-day basis and across the lifespan. Silverman writes that all of the Autism Network International original founders had been branded so-called low functioning as children, and they had gone on to earn university degrees. He says that even highly verbal adults can temporarily lose the ability to speak. One problem with the term low functioning is that using it can hide capacities that might be evoked in a more suitable environment or through an alternate means of communication. Treatment goals and research focuses necessarily reflect values. The goals of treatment, and hence the focuses of outcome research, are inextricably linked to one's stance on the debate between the biomedical cure and the social difference perspective. Thus, as researchers and therapists, we can't avoid taking a stand on this issue, even if it's only implicit in our efforts. Bagatelle observes how parents advocate for interventions to help their child fit in socially by normalizing their behavior. However, from the perspective of autistics, the purpose of these interventions is to deny the validity of the autistic experience by attempting to make them into neurotypical individuals. Jim Sinclair, an autistic self-advocate, addresses this notion of fitting in. Asking autistic people to fit in just for the sake of fitting in is imposing an alien and incomprehensible structure on our lives. I take the view instead that autistic people, like all people, need to be taught to behave in a way that they do not intrude on other people's boundaries. If a student is displaying behavior that actively interferes with other people, such as unwelcome touching, taking things that belong to others, making noises when people are trying to concentrate, flipping lights on and off, when other people in the room find that distressing, then it's appropriate to intervene, regardless of whether the student is autistic or not. But if a student is engaging in a behavior that is merely weird, but doesn't affect anyone else, such as rocking, flapping, spending free time sorting and lining up his or her own toys instead of playing with other children, and if the behavior is not distressing to the student, then this is the student's own business and not a matter for professionals to interfere with. The basic idea is about freedom, personal freedom, to be how one wants to be. In the past, goals for the treatment of autism have been based on what neurotypical individuals imagined they would want if they were in an autistic mind. But the new literature shows that this is a skewed way of looking at things. It involves projecting neurotypical needs onto autistic people. Autistic people just want the freedom to do what they please as long as it does not intrude on the rights of others. And this is the criterion that should determine what autistic behaviors should be focused on in treatment and research, and what types of neurotypical expectations are unfairly placed on autistic people. I'd like to talk about some research now. Research has generally been seen by autistic people as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. This gives researchers who have the privilege of using social resources to pursue their interests even greater responsibility to do so with an awareness of the needs and desires of the primary stakeholders in the research. An important consideration related to traditional outcome research is the uniqueness of autistic individuals. A common refrain among self-advocates and their supporters is that if you meet one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Silverman reports that geneticists support the notion that people with autism are not defined genetically by their autism. They may not have enough in common biologically to be considered a class of individuals for purposes of treatment. It's thus questionable if autistic people can meet the criteria of a shared diagnostic group necessary for studies such as randomized controlled trials. Before talking about suggestions for research, it's important to discuss some of the problems with prior research. This is the only way to avoid the mistakes of the past. For years, families desperate to help their autistic family members have been led astray and taken advantage of by those promising cure by medical and behavioral means. The research and cure focus of the predominance of autism researchers has led to the devoting of resources to discredited and abusive treatments. Ari Neiman characterizes the traditional autism community as offering nothing more than discredited theories about vaccines, pseudoscientific treatments, and the rhetoric of pity and despair. He critiques these programs for inflated and undocumented claims and observes that those who peddle pseudoscientific treatments collect hundreds of thousands of unreimbursable dollars from families justifiably desperate for a way to secure opportunities for their children. From the perspective of self-advocates, aversive and non-aversive treatments based on behavioral theory are unethical and abusive. They are done without consent, which is only ethical if you think autistic people are not capable of providing informed consent. 2, it's abusive. And 3, it targets aspects of the person that are not problematic in terms of protecting someone against himself or against other people. Bagatelle makes the point that societies have traditionally targeted human attributes for elimination that are subsequently shown to be nothing more than an acceptable variation of human functioning. These include things such as left-handedness and homosexuality. Research that Lovaas himself conducted. Given this history, she argues that behavior therapies involving non-consenting clients should require an ethical review process in order to decide which behaviors should be treated. Many autistic people critique ABA based on issues of consent because it's focused on rendering autistic persons indistinguishable from non-autistic persons, thus denying the validity of their experience. And whether or not aversives are used and their employment is no longer common, autistic self-advocates such as Sparrow Rose Jones consider ABA to be a form of abuse to induce compliance. Her words again. Children like I was are taught to be compliant. That's what 90% of autism therapy looks like to me. Compliance training. They become hungry for those words of praise, those good girls, the M&Ms or stickers or other tokens you use to reward them. They learn quickly that when they do what you want them to do, they are a good girl. And when they try to do what they want, they are a bad girl. There were millions of minor experiences along the way in my life, chipping off my understanding of myself as something owned by myself and not something owned by the world around me. We can look at Lovaas's treatment involving pain, fear, and nutritional deprivation with contemporary standards and see it as a form of abuse that would not occur with contemporary research protections. But Lovaas and his colleagues didn't think that what they did was abusive, and yet in the present we hear from autistic adults that ABA, a widespread treatment approach, is a form of abuse that is cruel, ineffective, and that it makes people less human, not more. The reports of self-advocates force us as professional researchers to a level of self-examination to ensure that the treatments we are studying not only are congruent with what autistic people want for themselves, but are in fact doing no harm to them. If you believe in the values of diversity, respect for the freedom and self-determination of all people, the honoring of individual identity and differences, and the empowerment of marginalized and abused members of society, it's imperative to develop research approaches congruent with the views of these primary stakeholders. Bagatelle embraces this perspective, arguing that research offering ethnographic insight, combined with the voices of people with autism, has the potential to reshape how services are delivered. This type of partnership in participatory action research projects holds out the best promise of developing research focuses and treatment interventions congruent with the wishes of the autistic community. Not only can autistic people be included as participants in projects developed by researchers, they can also be included as equal co-researchers. Silverman observes how the disability rights slogan, "Nothing about us without us," can be extended past the creation of policy to the actual conduct of scientific research. He cites the example of a psychiatrist at the University of Montreal, Laurent Motron, who has engaged in a detailed series of research projects in autism in collaboration with an autistic researcher named Michelle Dawson. There are an increasing number of organizations devoted to advocacy for autistic people and to giving them a voice in the research in which they are the greatest stakeholders. Here are a few of those organizations. First, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. This is an autistic-run organization that collaboratively supports researchers and professionals. It's working to expand services and to alter public perception and counter misinformation about autism. One of its projects focuses on the ethical, legal, and social implications of autism research. It was funded by the U.S. Administration on Developmental Disabilities. And it began with a symposium of researchers, self-advocates, family members, and activists. The symposium addressed ethical concerns in autism research, such as prenatal testing, community participation in research methodologies, appropriate and inappropriate intervention goals, enhancing the effectiveness and inclusivity of IRBs, and setting diagnostic criteria. Second group is the Academic Autistic Spectrum Partnership in Research and Education, or ASPIRE. ASAN is the community partner organization of ASPIRE, a community-based participatory research collaboration with autistic adults and their non-autistic supporters. ASPIRE is a multi-university research group that brings together academic researchers, autistic adults, and autism community members. Its purpose is to design and conduct research projects relevant to the need of autistic adults. It's based on the principles of community-based participatory research, whereby academics and community members serve as equal partners throughout the research process. Included in its mission is, one, encourage the inclusion of people with autism in matters which directly affect them. Two, include people on the spectrum as equal partners in the research. Three, to answer questions that are considered relevant by the autistic community. And four, to use research findings to affect positive change for people on the spectrum. Also, the Autism Acceptance Project and Autism Network International are potential collaborating organizations for autism research aimed at quality of life issues. Also, Autism Network International has hosted AUTREAT, an autistic-run conference, since 1996. Outreach IT is a community-based participatory research project group in the UK with two current action research projects. It's introducing and monitoring the use of voice-activated communication aids in residential care, and it's introducing computers into a similar residential care setting. All of these self-advocates and organizations are arguing for a complete reorientation of research in autism. ASPIRE provides a model of how collaborative research can be done, focusing on quality of life rather than cure. Neiman says that the partnership with ASPIRE is laying the groundwork for a new kind of autism research paradigm, which includes autistic people as full partners in the creation and implementation of rigorous studies on issues relating to the quality of life of autistic people. The traditional focus of autism advocacy, which focuses on eliminating the spectrum rather than pursuing quality of life, must be changed. The cure agenda has dominated research, with almost no attention being paid to quality of life. In 2010, Robertson found over 150,000 papers on autism, with only a small fraction devoted to real-life concerns that impact autistic adults, such as access to essential augmentative and alternative communication, social acceptance, and compatible employment options. Sherlock's quality of life framework is argued for by Robertson, himself an autistic researcher, as an evaluation tool compatible with the neurodiversity framework. Robertson reports that Sherlock's quality of life framework has been used widely in disability studies. It assumes a social model of disability and includes the importance of self-determination and self-advocacy. Sherlock's scale was built on the review of 30 years of quality of life literature and includes 8 core domains: self-determination, social inclusion, material well-being, personal development, emotional well-being, interpersonal relations, rights, and physical well-being. I'd just like to make a few comments on the relationship between music therapy and certain domains of Sherlock's scale. And these comments are just meant to be suggestive, not exhaustive, and just providing some ways in which they're relevant to core music therapy focuses. The first, difficulties in participating fully in social life. This really is a major problem for autistic people, and it's one in which music therapists can have a significant impact. Social participation is important in and of itself, but also as a contributor to self-esteem. It's hard to feel like a valuable member of society if you cannot participate in that society. This can be done in a number of ways, some of which are grounded in community music therapy practices. I could direct you to Coco Villalafon's research into how the inner programs with typically developing children benefited both groups, fostering social participation and changing community attitudes. In terms of material well-being and maintaining employment. Maintaining employment is an essential human activity for many reasons. Well, it provides for material survival, it's an important component of social life, and it's also a component of feelings of self-worth. Many of the difficulties in maintaining employment can be addressed in music therapy. These include difficulty in acclimating to change, mastering the social and communicative demands and practices of the workplace, coping with sensory demands over which one may have no control, engaging in goal-oriented cooperative team efforts, and coping with negative responses to the manifestations of autism. Music therapy groups, I think, are also particularly well suited to addressing these concerns. For many years, the Northrop Robbins Center at NYU had a group of adolescents and young adults who were aging out of the Department of Education's programs and were being prepared for vocational training. They were in the transitions program and worked in music therapy on goals related to successfully maintaining employment. And last, just some comments on autism and mental health in music therapy. Autistic people have the same mental health needs and challenges as neurotypical people. In fact, they suffer from depression, bipolar disorders, anxiety, OCD, and schizophrenia at significantly higher rates than the general population. While much research in music therapy focuses on the domains specific to the diagnosis of autism, such as communication deficits, these other areas are equally important, particularly in considering music therapy research with verbal adults. Sparrow Jones discusses how the structure of verbal interaction in psychotherapy doesn't work well for her, suggesting that it may not be a suitable treatment form for all autistic adults. Talk therapy doesn't work for me because it requires talking, and that required talking has to be about deep and troubling issues. And I can't talk about deep and troubling issues unless I've written them out. And they've transformed from being deep and troubling issues to be merely a recounting of past history from a script I wrote out once. So talk therapy for me is pointless. Anything I talk about is something I'm pulling out of my history just to please the therapist. No real work is being done. So again, music therapists have a special opportunity and obligation, I would say, to provide psychotherapeutic care that may not be possible through other treatment forms. And interpersonal relations. There are few resources for helping autistic adults navigate the challenges in creating and sustaining friendships, work relationships, and romantic relationships. Group music therapy provides an opportunity in which autistic people can work on these skills and the fears and other obstacles that come up in establishing relationships. Because it's nonverbal and yet has many of the qualities of verbal relationship, auditory sequencing, turn-taking, group efforts, expression of thought and affect, real-time in-person responsiveness. It can be a less threatening domain in which to explore social relationships. Now I'd like to just talk about some applications in music and music therapy that are consistent with principles of neurodiversity. The first project I'd like to talk about is the Autism Ensemble. The Autism Ensemble is a music performance collective comprising autistic children, their parents, and professional musicians representative of diverse world music cultures. Music play sessions and performances take place on a specially designed EWOMP, or Exploratory World Music Playground. And they're oriented toward achieving autism's mission of providing direct services to people with autism and facilitating autism acceptance. Its founder, Michael Bacham, is an ethnomusicologist who makes no claim that his program is a form of music therapy. But its basis in allowing the participating children to define their own terms of creative exploration and social engagement as music makers makes it compatible with community music therapy practices. Music therapists could adopt this perspective to produce a program congruent with neurodiversity principles. In autism, the musical world of the EWOMP is the culture being studied, and the autistic children are the cultural insiders of that world. Bacham proposes that adopting an ethnomusicology perspective could assist music therapists in making a partial paradigm shift from pathology to neurodiversity. In his work studying Balinese gamelan musicians, Bacham describes doing what ethnomusicologists typically do. In coming to know their world, he didn't look to identify impairments as deficits. He didn't look to fix or improve their music, to change their behavior or values, or to remedy their predilection for paired tunings, which are very jarring to Western ears. As an ethnomusicologist, his job was not to change them, but to understand them and relate to them on their terms. So an ethnomusicologically informed music therapy practice would involve not the treatment of autistic people, but in cultivating venues and facilitating outlets for their own agency on their own terms. The Musical Autist is an organization based on principles of neurodiversity and self-advocacy for autistic people. It's dedicated to creating community through sensory-friendly concerts, structured with the needs of autistic people in mind. The organization is a service delivery entity and an advocacy group. The two missions are integrated seamlessly. Through sensory-friendly concerts, community music therapists, and this is a music therapy program, can address many of the needs autistic people have as they themselves have identified them, such as the need for communal experience, community integration, and opportunities for self-advocacy. One of the greatest needs for autistic people is for enriching community involvement in all domains of human experience, including the arts. Sensory-friendly concerts are an example of how to structure experiences to make them accessible to autistic people so that they can share equally in them. Just as hearing impaired people are provided with sign language in a live performance or scrolling text for movies, sensory-friendly concerts provide an environment where autistic people can share equally in the human right to music, because they're a place where autistic behaviors are accepted. Shiloh and Lagasse report on a program evaluation of 5 sensory-friendly concerts that was implemented through a survey provided to attendees. There were 115 adults attending the concerts, a third of whom completed the survey. The program evaluation had a few purposes: to assess awareness of neurodiversity and community music therapy, to access the attendees' beliefs about how well the concerts address concerns of neurodiversity and community music therapy, to gather information on how the autistic attendees engaged with the program, and to discover why people attended the concerts and how they experienced it. So there was a moderate degree of behavioral changes noted among participants, rated at a mean of 3.03 on a 5-point scale, where 5 represented the greatest change and 1 represented no change at all. Here are some examples of parents' comments indicating different levels of social engagement. They include that some of the attendees displayed their typical behaviors, while others demonstrated new social behaviors, such as venturing away from parents. In terms of the satisfaction ratings, participants communicated great satisfaction with the overall experience, as all scores were either 4 or 5 on a 5-point scale, with a mean of 4.81, where 5 indicated that they thoroughly enjoyed the concert and would participate again in the future. The 2 core social purposes of the sensory-friendly concert were observed. The first was to create an artistic performance environment accepting of neurodiversity. Parents and caregivers reported that it was wonderful to be able to bring children to an artistic event where autistic behavior was accepted and could be used as the basis for participation. The second goal was to achieve the first goal without sacrificing the musical legitimacy of the performances. Several participants offered comments in this area, such as this one. Wow, this was real music, classically trained and high quality, not the poor leftovers people with disability usually receive. A prime benefit of the event was to allow participants to experience music as an art form while interacting with other families. Here is a first-person account from an autistic concert attendee. Generally, autistic people can move around without getting dirty looks from the neurotypical people sitting in the crowd. People on the spectrum can interact with each other, engage musically and socially. In my own life, sensory-friendly concerts allowed me to meet and connect with other autistic kids. Sensory-friendly concerts allow us to express our neurologic differences. The parents and caregivers can relax, knowing that their child can socialize with kids who are different. Each child is permitted to display autistic behavior, like stimming and vocalizing. They can go to sleep knowing that their child is accepted and loved in this environment, no matter what their different brain structure is. Those of us on the spectrum can rest assured that we're accepted for who we are and embraced for what we are. I'd like to talk about one last project, a recent doctoral dissertation, Maya Kressel-Morom from Bar-Ilan University in Israel. This research project, her doctoral dissertation, incorporated 2 separate studies whose results were combined. The first study involved a microanalysis of music therapy sessions with 3 children with autism, who in the researchers' view used excessive echolalia. The video segments that were analyzed consisted of an echoed phrase and the interactions that immediately preceded and followed it. Spectrograph analysis focused on the musical characteristics of the speech events, such as its melodic contour, intensity, and the temporal elements, such as tempo and rhythm. The therapist and the client's speech was analyzed. Results of the client analysis focused on the functions that echolalia served for the client, along with the distinct musical characteristics associated with each function. Results of the therapist analysis revealed categories of responses that were related to the client functions. The second part of the study consisted of interviews with 7 adult autism representatives, 5 with high-functioning autism and 2 mothers of daughters with autism, and 7 music therapists who work with children with autism and encounter echolalia in their work. The participants were asked to discuss how they conceptualize echolalia, its musical traits, and its functions for children with autism. Results showed that the autistic representatives connected echolalia to flawed sensory functioning and to unique cognitive styles. The music therapists connected it to anxiety. Both groups connected it to learning and to memory problems. Combining the findings of the 2 studies provided some novel results. The first study strongly supported the idea that echolalia has important emotional, cognitive, and communicative functions. It helps resume equilibrium, it helps to stay focused, it helps in the investigating of sounds and words, it can serve to block or mask the interlocutor, it helps with grasping troublesome content, it helps one to stay in communication. All of these functions were corroborated by the 14 interviews in study 2. For example, category 1 is concerned with the child's resuming equilibrium after being disturbed. And category 4 features echolalia segments meant to block intrusions. Both of these categories were strongly supported by the testimonies of the autism representatives, who spoke of sensory dysfunctions that can be confusing, troubling, or even overwhelming, and can lead a child to use echolalia as a form of self-regulation. The first study highlights detectable musical features that characterize individual styles of speech production. Each clinical dyad rendered a particular profile in the way that echoes were produced and responded to. In other words, the various communicative dialogues of functions of individuals, functions of echolalia, have musical characteristics that are detectable and consistent. This result of the microanalysis was also corroborated by the music therapist interviews, as they discussed their attunement to the intonation features of certain delayed echoes of autistic children. Becoming acquainted with the sonic features of both dyad partners speaking is an important opening into the child's inner world, which can be used to glean information about subjective experience and the possible reason that the child reverts to echolalia. So much like any progressive change in the world, many people will have to give up cherished beliefs in order to accommodate the human rights of a persecuted group, including the most basic right of self-definition. Some parents may have to give up the idea that their child could be cured and become the same as neurotypical children. Some therapists will have to learn to yield more control and autonomy to their clients. Some researchers may have to acknowledge that the research funds that provide their livelihood are based on outmoded and oppressive practices. Well, what about us? What about music therapists and music therapy researchers? What cherished beliefs do we have to forego? What commitments that many of us have built careers on have to be abandoned in order to allow progress to occur? More personally, speaking to you now, I ask myself, what am I willing to let go of in order to embrace what is right? In an address to the Autism Society of Canada, Jim Sinclair, an early autistic self-advocate, took it as his mission to dispel several long-standing myths, starting with Lovas's notion that there was a normal child trapped within the autistic shell, waiting to be rescued. As much as I deplore Lovas's treatment method and legacy, I have to make a painful admission. His idea of the normal child trapped within the autistic one reminds me of Northrop Robin's concept of the music child trapped within the conditioned child. One of the central notions of Northrop Robin's music therapy. It's something to which I've devoted much of my career to promoting. And yet this notion that's motivated me and that I thought was so beautiful and profound when I first encountered it now appears to me as something quite different. Perhaps the concept of the music child is merely a projection of our neurotypical minds, serving to reassure us that the person whose actions are unintelligible, frightening, or strange to us is really the same as us inside. So I'm left entertaining the possibility that one of my core beliefs is preventing me from seeing autistic people for who they are, apart from my desire for them to be just like me. To act in accordance with my core beliefs and values regarding the rights of autistic people may require me to abandon this central belief, or maybe to grow beyond it. Maybe this concept has performed its function for the last 40 years since it was first proposed, and it could be time to move on to new concepts and values. Or perhaps we have to just reframe this model, where the condition is not autism itself, but any inner or outer obstacle to becoming a more fully realized being. In this way, the model becomes a more universal one. It becomes a way of uniting all people rather than dividing us. There are central concepts of Northrop Robin's music therapy that are congruent with modern progressive developments. I see this in the sense of taking up what the autistic person does and plays, treating it as an expression of that being at the moment in time, respecting it, working with it, accepting it, not trying to squelch it, and instead engaging with it as a means of communication. This has always been a central tenet of Nordhoff-Robbins practice. And Nordhoff-Robbins is nothing if not pragmatic and empirically based. If the Nordhoff-Robbins community moves beyond this conception, I think that Clive himself would really take pleasure in the fact that this continued evolution of the approach has taken place in response to contemporary developments. Other aspects of the social view of autism that are well supported by Nordhoff-Robbins music therapy is the focus on self-actualization rather than normalization. It's ironic, as Clive used to say, we don't normalize people. We try to bring them to the peak of their abilities. And he said this almost in an apologetic way, like it's too bad we can't normalize them. But the new perspective is to see this focus on self-actualization rather than normalization as a positive element that is actually in line with the wishes of self-advocates. Sparrow Rose Jones again pleads for us to abandon the pursuit of normalization for this focus on self-actualization. Don't focus so much energy on making us look normal. That's a waste of time. We're not normal, and we'll never be normal. We are autistics, and we are better off when you focus your energy on helping us to be the best autistics we can be. If we look funny, people will learn to handle that. They will get used to that. It's more important that we feel safe, calm, happy, competent. If we flap our hands, if we don't look people in the eye, if we communicate through typing, or we speak in a monotone manner. But I see so much focus on those things as if getting us to look right is all that's required to enact a cure. Too many people seem to think that if we look like everybody else, their job is done and we're cured. And in fact, this energy put into being normal is actually counterproductive, she says. The monumental effort I put forth every day to try and fail to look like everybody else is sapping my talents and potential. All my energy, all my intelligence goes into looking normal. There's nothing left over to do a good job at something. When the most important thing is for me to look and sound like everybody else around me, all I have personal resources for is showing up. That's all you can get from me. Regardless of how far anyone wants to go in accepting this new view, what is inarguable is that there is a live issue about diversity and the limitations of the biomedical view that has to be taken into account in all future discussions and plans for research. A broad view of the situation will accept the desire for positive changes in society. Certainly, as our lives become increasingly based on electronic connection and communication, in real and important ways, our society is becoming more autistic. Walk down any street in Manhattan, you'll see people who are not interacting with each other face to face, but rather they'll be staring into an electronic device while they are isolating themselves from the sensory impact of their surroundings, even as it occupies their mind on other tasks, other interests, even obsessions. Who can deny the congruence of the contemporary electronic world with the preferences of autistic minds? As Bagatelle says, as society is transformed by technology, the nature of human sociality may be scaffolded and transformed in ways that come to mirror an autistic sociality, and thus reframe the disabling properties of autism itself in more positive terms. Moreover, interdisciplinary research holds the promise of illuminating the experiential world, values, and the minds of autistic people, so that the very notion of what it means to be a human being will expand to include neurologically diverse groups. Thank you.